Robert Stanley here. A truly happy new year to you and yours. I'm feeling good about 2018, people. This is our year. Let's make a difference. Let's try to remember to tell the loved ones how we feel. To love yourself, too. Don't forget about you. Let's all resolve to put the effort where it belongs, because the grass is always greener where you water it. And maybe try meth this year, Why not? I'm hearing good things about the meth. Don't do that. Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. In this episode, I debate a libertarian. Anybody know a good Ayn Rand joke? Because now is the time.
And let me assure you that we are going to take our fight for economic justice, for social justice, for environmental sanity, for a world of peace.
And I think it should be, religion, treated with ridicule and hatred and contempt. And I claim that right.
One aspect of American U.S. life and culture that I think that does deserve respect and admiration is protection of freedom of speech. The U.S. is unique in the world in that respect.
The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way of the cosmos to know itself.
Quoting the Bible is not going to get you anywhere because you haven't demonstrated why anybody should consider the Bible to be true or authoritative.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You're going to spend your whole life preparing to meet the Lord. Boy, you folks are crazy as hell.
We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
Jimmy Wood recently asked me to come on his Libertarian show and debate him about whether socialism is ethical. He hosts Radcap Radio, as in radical capitalism. Radical capitalism. We had a fairly constructive conversation. I wish it had gone a little better, but he was very kind, and I think he did a great job. I wanted to share that discussion with my listeners because we hadn't had a debate in a little while. So here you go, folks. Jimmy Wood from Radcap Radio.
Culture is not your friend. Culture is for other people's convenience and the convenience of various institutions, churches, companies.
We very naturally, as a cognitive and behavioral imperative, we form descriptions of the world and we try to figure out what's going on.
If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works. Bitches.
Usually the biggest disagreement in all arguments comes down to definitions. And Robert, I'd like you to introduce yourself and provide me with your definitions of socialism and even capitalism.
Hey, happy to be here. With definitions, I totally agree with you that we're probably going to talk right past each other if we don't at least identify how we view each thing. In reference to socialism, it's a goal. It's not necessarily a thing that exists in the real world in the same way as democracy. I'm not being vague on purpose. It's just unfortunate that whenever we talk about something in particular, like socialism, you have to talk about it in terms of its progressive sense. And I don't mean progressive in like a liberal way of saying it. I mean it in terms of how it's going to progress over time, right? So let's say America, for instance, United States of America is not a democracy on paper, right? It's a constitutional republic, right?
Yeah, that's what it is supposed to be, yeah. It operates more like a democracy, I would think, or argue.
Right. And that you and I would probably agree on that a constitutional republic is a form of democracy. But also our government is a form of socialism already in many aspects. Would we agree there?
Yeah, Article 1, Section 8 gives the state the power to tax, unfortunately.
Yeah, and not just with taxing, but with lots of stuff. I mean, even having a military itself is a form of socialism.
I wouldn't agree with that because, I mean, I've kind of been, not to be rude, but waiting for a particular definition, and I'm going to jump in with mine. Socialism is an institutionalized interference with or aggression against private property and private property claims. So, like, just because, like, you were to group up with a group of people and decide that we're going to be a military and defend this area. That doesn't necessarily require, by nature, an institutionalized aggression against private property. People can come together and agree to have this, and even come together and agree to, without aggression, pay for the military and pay for their own defense, like by subscribing to private companies who compete in a market of competing private security firms to be the best security firm, right? So I would disagree that you would that military.
Definitely.
Okay, go on.
Well, I cut you off. I'm sorry, but your definition of socialism is basically taxation, then, right? That's kind of what.
Well, I mean, an institutionalized, yeah. I mean, to almost barrel it down, you could say that, you could summarize it in that, in a way. But it's also a form of ultimate decision making of a territorial monopolist, because the institutionalized entity that interferes with private property is the same one that, you know, makes all your social regulations as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can't have socialism without some form of taxation. So I could see where you're attacking the beast right at its heart, basically. Whenever you use that definition, I understand your reasoning, but like you're leaving out all the ownership of the means of production, and you know, all the, to me, the really fascinating parts about socialism. If that's appropriate to just deal with taxation right off the bat, I guess that's what we could probably talk about. Before that, though, in terms of the military, you're saying that we could have a military without taxes if it was like voluntary or a privately owned one or something like that?
There could be many different forms of militaries, privately owned, privately funded, by happily paying customers that could withdraw their money at any time if they were displeased. Yeah, it could be done without taxation.
Wouldn't you be worried that I would come take your stuff with it?
No, because there would be other options to defend myself against that, and there'd be multiple firms I could go to. And also if a firm wanted to do that against people, especially in a society where private property is the purpose of the foundation of society, they're not going to keep funding a private firm that is violating property rights. Do you see what I'm saying? Like in a society where people value property rights, they wouldn't fund someone openly violating property rights, and even they wouldn't be happy to fund someone who was even secretly violating private property rights. However, you would do that.
I do not follow. In a society where people value private property rights, you're saying I wouldn't come and take your stuff?
I'm not saying that it would never happen. Like no one, I'm not saying that just because the society was privatized there wouldn't be thievery. Of course, there'd still be people stealing things, but there'd be a lot less chances, especially if there's not a giant centralized territorial monopoly on ultimate decision making and taxation. A government like the federal one that we talk about, that we're living in right now, that spans a whole continent and has 300 million tax livestock that are fairly well producing and can, you know, feed the state a lot to where it can, you know, bring about a giant force to take on whatever thing opposes it. If we broke that up by secession and by privatization, all of these firms, they wouldn't be, you know, monolithic. I mean, they could come together in times of desperate need and become monolithic forces in the world, military forces. But when they wouldn't need to do that, the people would just be defending their private property and living by the private property norms. And this is also talking in a sense of outside this current social order in a way. I'm kind of talking about how people would act in like a libertarian social order, just on top of that.
I don't see why you would be confident that if we had privatized military, for instance, and I know this isn't what we were necessarily wanting to talk about in particular, but I'm just curious. I want to understand your point. If we had privatized military, I just don't see your point as to why that wouldn't mean that, let's say, someone with more money than you would then be able to violate your rights just easily.
Not necessarily.
You know what I mean?
I mean, you couldn't get away with paying someone. I mean, if you paid someone to go and attack someone else or something, I mean, or tried to. I mean, what do you even define this aggression as by using your money to aggress against someone?
As a hypothetical, if I'm a millionaire and you're poor, in that scenario, you're not going to purchase a private self-defense military, right?
Well, no, and I'm not saying that people would purchase like their own entire military. It would be like almost like police departments that we have now, except much more ethical, because they would be privately funded and only funded by happily paying customers who would approve of their defense of private property.
Oh, okay. So you would be counting on a police department, for example, to be ethical.
Not necessarily. I mean, they would also have someone right behind them competing with them in the market, to where if they did become unethical, that people would have another option to go to right away. If there's no territorial monopolist, the government, who can keep competitors out of the market, such as security, because private firms can't compete with the police department right now, right? So if that's not there, then people would have other options to go to if their current main security provider went rogue, so to speak.
Wouldn't it be more profitable to be unethical?
Not necessarily, no. You make more. People who are rich don't make money by stealing it from people. They make it by producing a product or service that is valuable to people, unless they have their help from the government, which that happens all the time. Google does it, Apple does it. They use the state and socialism to keep their competitors out of the market.
People who are rich don't do so by taking money from someone else. I have a problem with that statement alone.
Well, but would you call buying something at the store stealing? Because that's a consensual transaction, and that's
stealing is different from taking money from someone else, right? We would say that stealing is taking money from someone else, but you can take someone's money without stealing it.
Well, that would be called fraud, and that's also a violation of property rights because it's a violation of informed consent.
Absolutely, but I could also take your money by legal ways in the market. I'm still taking it. I could say, I know that you need to eat, and let's say I have a monopoly on food, for instance, then I'm going to be taking your money. That's the whole system of the market, is to take your money so that you don't have the option to keep it.
Even with the state that we have now and its power to enable monopolies, there's still not a monopoly on food. I mean,
no, of course not.
It would take a while.
I was trying to use something really, really easy that we could agree would be a need. But let's say.
But just because people need something doesn't mean that that they have a right to it. A need doesn't equal a right.
No. I'm not claiming rights here. I'm saying more in terms of, I know you have to eat. So if I have the food. Like I always like the analogy of an island, right? Because it takes out all the confusion and cited discussions that we could have, right? Rabbit trails and what have you. We're on an island, you and I, and if I have all the coconuts, and that's all we can eat, right? It's a shitty island. We just have coconuts. If I have all the coconuts, wouldn't you agree that there is a moral issue about you having 0 coconuts and me having 100 coconuts? Like, wouldn't you see that scenario and look at it and say,
well, no, it depends. Did I lay on my butt while you took your 36 hours and went and got all the coconuts, or did I help you and you took them from me? This is one of those lifeboat scenarios, kind of, it seems like.
Yeah. I get that it's silly, and even if we didn't add in a backstory as how did I get the coconuts, or why don't you have coconuts, just that scenario alone, I have 100 coconuts, you have 0 coconuts. Just seeing that, if we just saw a painting of it, wouldn't we both conclude that there's something wrong here? You have basic needs that are not being met or not going to be met.
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's something that's wrong, but I would say that maybe the guy without coconuts should offer some kind of service to the guy who has coconuts for some coconuts so he can survive. There needs to be no third party come into this situation and force the guy with 100 coconuts to give the guy with none, who has done nothing, apparently, to get the coconuts, to have coconuts, because he has no inherent right to something just because he needs it.
What if my demand for you to get a coconut is just something that is unethical in itself? What if it's like some horrible sex demand? You know what I mean? Or something like where I say, you have to do this for me. You have to satisfy some dirty sex need for me in order to get a coconut. I mean...
In this crazy situation, if I was the guy, I'd just tell you, like, fuck off, I'm gonna go eat some fucking grass or some bark off this tree, and I'm gonna try to make my way to somewhere else or catch some fish, something. But in the end, the ethical question comes down to is, should someone step in and force the guy who has 100 coconuts to give the guy with none some? And I don't think they should. And especially in this lifeboat situation, there's no reason to. I think that would be a violation of property rights to take the guy's property. Who there was no other counterclaim. There was no former owner of those coconuts. We're on an island. It's just me and you. We just got there somehow. We popped up there, right? So there's no. All this property is unhomesteaded. It's unowned, and so the first person to claim the property and alter it, which would be taking the coconuts off the tree, you gather those coconuts, that's your property. To come in and take that property, that would be a violation of property rights, that would be socialism, and that would be unethical.
I like how you broke that down. That's fascinating. So as soon as I make the claim, these are my coconuts, I'm actually violating your rights already. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, no. I'm saying when we come upon this scenario, me and you popped up on this island. It's an unowned property. No one has ever claimed this property because it's just an island, right? It's just this scenario island. So the property there is unowned. And therefore, the first person, the first user to come in there and take claim to a certain section, to take claim to a certain thing, would be to take it, alter it, gather it, put it in a place that makes it your property. You have homesteaded that property, essentially, and now it becomes yours. It's first use principle.
That's fair. So in that scenario, you wouldn't see it unethical for me to have 100 coconuts and you to have 0 coconuts. You wouldn't see something wrong with that.
No, I'd see something wrong with it if you came and asked me if I had the 100 coconuts, you came and asked me for the coconuts, and I threw the coconut and hit you in the head with it. That would kind of be unethical, because that'd be violating your body. It'd be hurting you, so that would be unethical. But just owning the coconuts, even if it's all of them on the island, is not a violation of your property rights, because you never took the time to go and make a claim to any of them. Right, you waited till I gathered the coconuts, just like a good welfare whore, and then whenever the coconuts were gathered, you came and you tried to. Well, you asked them at least. You're not doing what the state does. The state doesn't ask me for my coconuts. The state and socialism takes them without my consent. Right. That's why I see it as unethical.
Like, we started with military stuff, and then we started talking about what was the second one? I think police or something.
Well, it pretty much it was breaking the military down to police, privatized security, essentially.
And we just got right to the core of the issue, which is an ethics issue. And I think we got to our difference right away. And I would argue that we probably agree on most everything else, depending on from this one point, this one coconut scenario, right? So if you say this is not unethical for you to have 0 and me to have all the coconuts, from that point alone, I probably could follow everything else you say about libertarianism and what have you, because I would say, well, if that's the case, then sure, I'm with you. Whereas you could look at my argument and say, if you look at that picture, just a painting on the wall, we're both standing there looking at it. One guy has 100 coconuts and he's sitting on top of them, right? And then another guy has 0 coconuts. I look at that and say, there's something wrong with this image. This image causes an emotional reaction in me, for instance, because I'm affected by the inequality that I see. If you could agree with me on that, then you would probably agree with me on all these topics about socialism.
I don't agree, but I understand why you see things like that. I mean, you went to a public school, did you not? A socialized public school, right?
Both. I was public school until high school, and then my parents put me in a private super Christian-y school. But
well,
yeah,
that was a good idea.
I had a lot of public school.
But anyway, at public school, they teach this radical egalitarianism, where they want to make kids believe that everyone is equal. That if they switch places with someone in the middle of Africa, that everything that happens in their lives would be totally the same, just depending on the environment that they're in. In which that's totally wrong. People are not equal. The genders are not the same. The races are not the same. It's just it's all a farce.
Equal. How are you unequal?
People are unequal in intellect, skill. You might not be able to dribble a basketball as well as I. You might not be able to run a football as well as I. You might have a better radio voice than I. You might, there's all kinds of inequalities to the nature of being human. We are not equal. It is a farce to believe that we are all equal. When they tell you that we are all equal, to make you believe that the rich have duped everyone else by because they tell that by telling you that we're all equal, the only way that they would have been able to do better than you, to get better than you, and be in a better position in life is if they cheated. The only way that Bill Gates can be better than me and richer than me is that because he cheated. He cheated me. He stole from me, the damn 1%. But in all reality, he used the government more than he stole from me, and that's a fact.
Yeah, I think we would agree about that. Probably that he used the government more effectively. Sure. And that's probably the majority of the time is what's happening. I think we would both say that's wrong, even though we have very, very separate economic philosophies, right?
Well, yeah, you're against monopolies, right?
To get back,
you hate monopolies as much as I do, right? Like, you're totally against monopolies.
I am against monopolies in the common colloquial sense of it, right? Like I don't want there to be a monopoly on shoes, for instance, but do I want there to be a monopoly on
taxation,
like for instance, or taxation or something like that? In that case, I would want there to be a monopoly. I would want a government to do that. Yes.
It's just so.
Which, I mean,
it's so crazy to hear socialists say they want a monopoly.
Yeah, and I get that there's a conflict here, right? To say that why would you be okay with that? But I have to admit that the government is monopolizing certain services. I want there to be a monopoly on prison, for instance. I wouldn't want that to be something that's everyone has equal ability to imprison people, right? I wouldn't want it to be something that's handled privately, for instance. I would want there to be a way for me to affect how people's rights are violated. If we have to get someone out of the public, right? This guy, he's just going around and he's just raping everybody. Okay, we got to get this guy away from the rest of us so that we can all get along and go to work and do our jobs, come home, watch TV without getting raped every day, right? So we take this guy, we got to put him somewhere. I don't want that to be up to the free market.
Well, you kind of want to socialize. Right, you want to socialize the cost and make it to where he is put away by the police who are socially funded. You want him to be put up in a prison that's socially funded by the government, to where the cost of dealing with this criminal is socialized, and therefore you assume it's cheaper on you, right?
Well, it's not whether or not it's cheaper. It's just the ethical issue is I don't want my rights to be able to be violated based on the free market. I would want my rights to be violated based on some kind of law that we all agree on, and I get to participate in it by saying.
That makes me cringe so hard. Wait up. Wait up.
What part bothered you? I almost said triggered.
The thing is that we can't. The current social order. We do not get the opportunity at any point in our lives to consent to it and to have very much of an opportunity to change much of it. We have no consent. Right. There is no consenting to the Constitution. You are born, and it is the debt that past generations have put on your shoulders is set on your shoulders when you're born. And in your prison situation, or you're putting away a criminal, what I find unethical is the socialization of costs. That is what I find most unethical about that situation.
Reducing this to like a money thing. So that's probably where we should go.
It's a property thing. It's not necessarily money. It's that taking someone else's money to achieve a certain end without their express consent is theft, and theft cannot be placed in a moral category.
I'll give you that one right off the top. Okay, so the conversation between a socialist and a libertarian, right from the first 10 minutes of the conversation, the socialist agrees taxation is theft. So I would say in terms of victories, you have pretty much won this round, because I got to agree with you there. But
if you agree with me there, though, how can you go any further into social? Because you cannot have socialism without a state. You cannot have a state without taxation. And you've already agreed that you can't.
You're just like, this debate is pretty much over.
Yeah,
that was fast.
And you already did agree that you can't have socialism without an institutionalized entity.
I agree with you 100%. And I think that this shows that we probably agree on a lot more than we think, but our argument is an ethical one. And what I think you're looking at saying, since taxation is theft, therefore it's wrong, therefore we shouldn't do it, end of story. And I say, taxation is theft. It's wrong, and we should still do it, even though it's wrong.
Ooh, it's just so cringy. It hurts. I cringe.
But here's my reason for thinking that. Is everything is a decision between something that's a little bit fucked up. Could I say fucked up on your show?
Absolutely.
Something that's a little messed up, and something that's a little less messed up, right? Like that's pretty much how we live our lives. That's the decisions we make all the time. And in this scenario, we just don't have a better system available to us than doing something that's wrong, like theft. This is the only way that we have come up with solution for, let's say, poverty, for instance. We'll just use that one because
more cringe, because I think that capitalism solved most of poverty.
I agree. Capitalism does help that. I don't know that I would say it solves it. Are you saying like laissez-faire, free market kind of capitalism would solve poverty itself?
It reduces poverty at a faster rate than any other economic system known to man, and that could even be conceived by man, because we've already went through about every economic ideology you can think of: socialism, communism, syndicalism. I mean, everyone in between: democracy, republicanism. The only one we haven't tried and legitimately tried is libertarianism, and real libertarianism.
Could we both admit that despite our differences, we would have to say that neither of us have a successful example of our philosophies? Could we admit that?
I would admit it in like a geographical area. It has never successfully happened or been tried. I would agree with that. But I would also disagree in a way and say that mine has more evidence of being efficient and possible through the free market or semi-free markets that we get to experience in our days and in history.
So whenever I'm talking about, I don't have a good example, I'm more referring to Marxism itself.
Yeah, you don't.
In terms of the modern way of using the term socialism, we could look at a lot of examples of success that are happening right now. I don't know if we would both agree that these are socialist countries. I think most people would agree to this, but I don't know that you would agree with me on that. But like Norway and Sweden, Denmark, countries like that.
I would agree that there's socialist mechanisms making those things happen, but I would not agree that they are even good things, even if they do benefit the people in the here and now. And that would be because through socialism, with this territorial monopolist making these decisions on where money goes, of course, everybody gets to see the obvious benefits of socialism, right? They get to see the school building, they get to see the teachers getting paid, they get to see, the roads being paved, all that stuff. But what they don't see is the unseen consequences, right? The money that gets taken from the family who doesn't get to go on that educational trip, who doesn't get as many or as high quality dinners put on their plate because the state is taking from them to provide to socialize all these services.
Why are you concerned about that?
Because the whole ethical problem with the state deciding what to do with other people's money is that they essentially have to, by threat of violence, steal their property, which is their money, to provide these services. And the unseen consequences are bad enough to me to outweigh the obviously seen benefits. And that doesn't even, you're not even considering all the money that's wasted, all the money that politicians get paid and they don't produce anything for society. There's all kinds of waste along this route if you want to socialize all these services. But if people really wanted these services and we privatized them, then the money would be spent much more efficiently. And the standard of living for people would rise exponentially compared to today.
Well, that's a claim that you don't have empirical evidence for. You could be right, and I totally see where you're coming from. Like you make a very logical argument about that, but in saying that you have to say hypothetically.
Can you tell me a government provided service that outcompetes a private service, a private company?
Oh, I don't think
you couldn't even point to a military, because even the United States, strongest military in the world, outsources to private companies to do their dirty work, because the private companies spend their money better than the state. It's just that's why it's not such a hypothetical. What I was saying, it's actually kind of a proven through repetition. Essentially, it's a fact. There's no way around it. Unless you can name, unless you can think of one.
With private industry outcompetes public services every time.
Absolutely.
Of course, yes. But does that mean that we want everything to be privatized? And I can understand that your answer to that would be, well, of course it outcompetes. It does. But my response to that is that there are certain things that money isn't going to buy. You know what I mean? There are certain things that the free market just isn't going to provide us that we get if we steal other people's money. You know what I mean?
That was such an R-selected statement. If you've ever heard of RK selection theory, that right there...
Help me understand.
It's really complicated. I mean, it's basically essentially like... it's a genetic reproductive strategies, right? And the R-selected, let's say like... bunnies are the primary example of an R-selected organism because they have massive amounts of children, but they don't put much resources into their children. They just let them go and hope they live. A wolf is a prime example of a K-selected because they have 1 or 2 kids and they put all their resources into raising those kids to be the best wolves they can be, right? But other R-selected things are like certain parasites, right? And they need a host. What you're saying is essentially there's these R-selected people who I would call socialists, who, like you said, they couldn't, within the free market, accumulate as much money as they would through socialized services. And that is why they choose to perpetuate the state. That's why they advocate for more statism. That's why they advocate for more welfare, is because they know that if they were released into a free market competitive environment, that they wouldn't be able to accumulate as much. Or they think that. There's even certain situations, a socialist or a welfare whore could produce more in the free market if they just had to give it a shot, right? And like you were saying a second ago, certain humans could not compete in the free market to where they would get the value that they could get out of the welfare state. So that is why certain humans, as you said, would rather have the socialized cost of things because they couldn't make the same living without the state redistributing producers' wealth to them or K-selected people's wealth to them.
Right. Of course there are some people that can't compete in the market, but the people that are promoting socialism aren't limited to just the people that can't compete. You know what I mean? Like there's people like me, for instance, that would likely do well in a free market scenario, but I am promoting a government-based system. I'm promoting taxation, promoting socialism, primarily because I'm concerned about those other people. If I know we all get paid by how many miles we run, let's say, and somebody only has 1 leg, well, even though I can run just as well as you can, I'm concerned about the guy that's over there hopping along and he's not making any money. So I would say that, we have to take a little bit of our race winnings and give it to the guy that only has 1 leg, because otherwise the system isn't fair. The system sucks.
Yeah, the system sucks, but I don't think it's the responsibility of anyone to do that for anyone else. I mean, it's certainly in a way the responsibility of close family, but the family, through radical egalitarianism, has been destroyed. The family, monogamous, nuclear structured family, has been destroyed. And that makes it even a worse environment for K-selected people and a better environment for R-selected people, because in that environment, without a family there to take care of a lot of people, because you know how many people are familyless, they resort to the state. And without the monogamous nuclear family being, culturally upheld, women are more promiscuous. They are more likely to be single mothers. That adds an even bigger burden on the environment, or at least for K-selected people, because that creates more R-selected people who create demand and an environment for socialism to perpetuate and even escalate.
It's difficult to talk to you in some ways, because here we have a really good point, I think, about our differences of whether or not we have a duty to that 1-legged guy, and as fellow contestants in the race, right? But then you bring up something about female promiscuity. I'm so tempted to go down that road.
But the reason it's because I was kind of assuming that the reason that guy doesn't have help is because his family hasn't been held together, because the cultural glue of the nuclear family has been wrecked. I mean, it's not cool to want to be in a nuclear family these days. It's not a cool thing to do. especially for millennial age people.
I think we would agree that family is important. I don't know that we would agree on.
To me, the family is what prevents the state. I mean, the more bonded the family is, and the more highly esteemed and valued the nuclear family is in a culture, the less violations of property right by the state will ensue.
Okay, but what about the guy that doesn't have someone to help him out?
Well, then that's, again, you could also look to the free market and see how much, even just in America, how much charity is given out every year, which it's an insane amount. And if there wasn't a state redistributing people's wealth, that number would be even higher, because they would give to the causes and to the people who provide the best charity services to who needs it. And the state doesn't exactly do that. People abuse this welfare state all the time, every day. It's not something that's like rare or uncommon.
I have a really positive view of humanity. It comes off almost, and take this comment with a grain of salt, because I don't mean it as an insult, but just so you understand, it comes off a little bit naive to me. You would think that people would just help each other like that.
If people aren't very nice and aren't very good, then why would you want to centralize and monopolize the power of the state to human beings? The human beings are going to be in control of the state, right?
Who else are we going to have do it?
Well, we shouldn't have anyone do it, but if people aren't good enough to rule over themselves and take care of themselves and each other, then what's going to make them good enough whenever you elect him King Emperor of America? You know, how is that going to make him any more of a good person? And how is, if these people are so unwise that they can't take care of themselves and each other, then why would you want them choosing a supreme leader to anything?
That's a very good point to say. If we are this bad, then why would we want government in the first place? That's a interesting point. But I would say we don't have any other option. To do your system would be putting so much faith into the market, and I haven't seen. I see benefits of the market. I'm not anti-capitalist, and I think that's a way that socialists are painted, that we're I'm anti-capitalist in as much as a neo-Marxian sense, right? Where I think that it should be criticized for what it gets wrong. But I'm not anti-capitalist in the sense of like I don't like competition.
But can you tell me what's so bad to you about capitalism? Because I really don't understand it. Like, what has capitalism done to you?
What has it done to me? I don't know that would be useful.
Well, I mean, what do you think, just in general, like even what, could you even define capitalism too? That would help a lot.
The use of the free market, what I think we would both agree to be capitalism.
Yeah, voluntary contractual agreements on trading property or exchanging property, somewhere along those lines.
So the negative impacts of this, the fact that we cannot get certain services from the free market to certain people if we do.
But what right do those people have to that service? If they have a right to someone else's services, that makes that person giving the service their slave.
Rights. I think we have different understanding of rights as well. Do you believe that you have rights that are like inalienable?
Well, I mean, the only kind of rights I believe in are property rights. So, I mean, you just can go from there, really. I mean, the right to exclude people from property you have justly acquired, essentially.
Would you agree that the only reason you have property rights is because we all agreed you do?
No. I have property rights because I am the only one who could. It's objectively a fact that I am the only one in control of my body. My body is my private property. You can maybe grab my arm and wave it around, but you can't make my arm move around, right? Only I can do that. It's my private property. And from there, obviously, I can't occupy space that you're occupying because that would be violating. I'd have to punch into you, I'd have to ram into you, violate your property rights to stand in the same place that you stand in. So that's why even in a Garden of Eden, where there's no such thing as scarcity, there really is still scarcity because we only have so much time. Time is a scarce resource, our bodies are a scarce resource, and space is a scarce resource. Like we couldn't stand in the same place at the same time. We couldn't, put our finger in the same hole in the same tree at the same time.
I like those. Those are good. The scarcity point, even with the Garden of Eden example, that's pretty cool. Okay, so rights being something that you actually have without us determining that you have them. We would disagree about the ethics of the coconut analogy, right?
Yeah.
And we would disagree about rights. And I think that
I think that rights aren't all like, I mean, property rights are cemented, but I mean there can be different like in my dream goal society there would be multiple different societies. Like let's say there's 20 different nations within what is known as the United States, right? There's 20 different nations, and all of these 20 different nations, or let's even say 75 different nations, they all have little bit different property norms. Like for example, in one place you can't paint your house black or something. You can't. I mean, there'd be different property norms agreed upon by these people living in different places. If somehow possible, which I don't think it'd be possible because of the economic calculation problem, if someone wanted to not bother the capitalists and the libertarian social orders, the societies, the libertarian covenant communities, as I call them, if some socialists wanted to make their own little thing according to private property rights and not violate anybody else's private property rights, I wouldn't give a damn, leave them alone. They're over there. As long as they don't, if they get anywhere over here, we might have a problem, but they need to stay over there. You're not, I want to establish a you're not welcome here culture to, communist, socialist, degenerates. It goes on and on. Like, I want to live in a society where people respect property rights and do not seek to use the state against me.
And I think we would agree with that if we both agreed on the ethics of the coconut and your view of rights.
No, I mean, hypothetically, yeah.
I would be 100% on your team. But I think because of these two fundamental issues, and it's kind of cool with this conversation is because we'll start going down a road, it'll reduce back to this fundamental philosophical difference that we have. And I don't know that there's any point in talking about school should be privatized or public. You know what I mean? Until we're able to solve the coconut ethics and the rights ethics.
Well, I don't see how the coconut relates to the educational topic, because it's not like we live in a world where one guy gets ridiculous education and everybody else gets shit. And even if we did have a privatized education, I still think, especially in the world we live in today, that everyone would get educated, even if the cost of education was not socialized.
Well, I was using the education as just an example of something that you and I would disagree about, that the reason that we disagree about it has a fundamental core point that deals with.
Well, I think we disagree about it because I assume that you think that without socializing the costs, people wouldn't get educated, right? Is that it?
Well, once again, I don't want to spend a lot of time focusing on that rabbit trail in particular. You know what I mean? I mean, if you want to discuss education being privatized or public, that's fine. But I feel like we're not going to get any understanding of each other's argument because we have fundamental difference on an ethical level, and we probably should talk about the ethics, I think.
Okay, well, can I read a Hans Hermann Hoppe quote to you over the morals of socialism?
Sure.
Not only economically, but in the field of morals, too, socialism turns out to be an ill-conceived system of social organization. Again, in spite of its bad public reputation, it is capitalism, a social system based squarely on the recognition of private property and of contractual relations between owners of private property, that wins outright. It will be demonstrated that the property theory implicit in capitalism not only passes the first test of universalization, but it also turns out to be the logical precondition of any kind of argumentative justification. Whoever argues in favor of anything, and in particular in favor of certain norms as being fair, must implicitly at least presuppose the validity of the property norms implicit in capitalism, deny their validity as norms of universal acceptability, and argue in favor of socialism is thus self-contradictory. Because like you said, you accepted that the state is, like, socialism can't exist without the state. You accepted that taxation is theft, and to argue in favor of socialism is kind of self-contradictory. It's almost like you're agreeing that these things are unethical, but at the same time you are arguing to implement these unethical things.
Yes.
And kind of also assuming that they're ethical because you're standing in the position of affirming the ethicality of socialism.
Yes, and you're right. There is a major contradiction here. The problem is, what else do we have available to us? So secession.
Have you never thought of seceding? Of trying to push secession efforts?
But here's what we're faced with. Okay, imagine if you were in a time machine and you go back to the time of feudalism, for example, and you're trying to convince these people, hey guys, this system sucks. All you guys have to do is just stop participating, right? Secede from this form of economy. But you have to have a mechanism for this change. Certain things happen. Certain technologies were invented. Certain governments collapsed, right? Or forms of government that they had at the time, for us to change into a more market-based economy. So there has to be a mechanism to get there. Right now, our only mechanism to ensure that people get what they need is via government. And I am simply...
But what is the ethical necessity? Why is it unethical of me to not provide someone else with something that they need? And why am I not being provided with all the stuff that I need? Because I need a bunch of stuff, and I mean, I don't pretend that it's anybody else's responsibility to provide me with those things.
Yes, I think you're right to go here with the conversation, because I think that's where we're both standing at the picture. You don't feel that it's wrong for one guy to have no coconuts, whereas I do. And I think you don't.
It's the situation behind the guy having one coconut. Like if his property rights were violated in a way that made it to where that guy had the 100 coconuts, like for instance, if some institutionalized aggression against private property was instituted on that island and gave that guy a monopoly on, like, he's the only one allowed to pick coconuts, then I'd say yes, that is totally wrong. He should not be given that monopoly by the state, and that property, which was, it wasn't necessarily stolen from that guy unless he had a prior claim to that property, but that guy should face punishments for utilizing the state to steal those coconuts, to keep those coconuts from being accessed by competitors, especially when he isn't the one who truly owned the property.
I'm sure you're familiar with John Rawls' Veil of Ignorance, but for any listeners that aren't familiar with it, it's basically a way to understand morality, right? So we're going to take, for example, slavery, and then evaluate that behind the veil of ignorance to determine if it's ethical or not. And the whole idea is, even though you and I would both obviously agree slavery is unethical, but we're just using that because it's an easy example. You and I step back behind a curtain, right? We can't see anything. We don't know what the world is going to be, but we're both going to make a decision about what kind of world we're going to create, okay? Whenever we jerk back the curtain, this is what we're going to have. So it's kind of, it's an easy way to think of it is ignorance. You have no knowledge of anything that's going to be there until we determine it in our conversation right now. And I say, hey, I think we should have slavery. And you would say, okay, I agree with you that we should have slavery, but which one of us is going to be the slave? Well, obviously, I think you should be the slave. And you're like, well, I think you should be the slave.
Well, yeah, because who wants their property rights violated?
Absolutely. So in that scenario, we would both agree, okay, let's not have slavery because we don't know if we're going to be the slave or not. But in that same scenario, you could apply that to the rich man or the poor man. I don't know if I'm going to be Donald Trump, for instance, not to make it all political, but neither of us are giant fans of Trump, right?
Yep.
But so we can use him as an example.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I'm going to have Donald Trump's money or if I'm going to have Robert Stanley's money. Behind the veil of ignorance, I'm not going to have this much of a wage gap, right? Because obviously I don't want to be the one that doesn't have any money. We could apply this to lots of stuff. So making it really simple with the coconuts, behind the veil of ignorance, it doesn't matter to us what the cause is leading up to 100 coconuts versus no coconuts. We just know that there's something wrong with this picture. We just know that we don't want to be the guy without coconuts. Would that be something that you could at least give a little bit of leeway to?
I mean, I couldn't apply whether that situation is ethical or not because I don't know what preconditions happened to before this situation, before this painting happened. You know, there could the guy on the left who with no coconuts could have literally acquired all of them, and then the guy on the right literally steals them. And, you know, if we're just looking at the painting, you know, all I could really say about it as a libertarian is, well, I mean, this painting is either good to me or it sucks, you know. I can only give a subjective argument to that.
But you know,
or value.
Needs to eat. That's why I'm using the coconut. It's not like one of them just gave all his coconuts away. And even if he did, there's still a problem because we have empathy.
Okay, looking at the picture, I would say that, yeah, the guy on the left has a problem with no coconuts. He needs to do something with his property, his body, whatever other property he might have. If he's got a little tract of land in there somewhere, he needs to use it to provide some kind of product or service to someone to get what he needs. No one else is required to provide him with what he needs. And if they are, they would be his slaves.
If someone were starving, you don't feel the moral responsibility to feed them?
If someone was starving and I walked upon them and they're starving, I would probably get them some food, but that's because I'm a human being, but that's not because I have an obligation to give them. That's because I see those people in need. I have the means to help them at that time, and I do. If I didn't have the means at that time, like if I didn't have my own shirt on my back and I was a week away from starving myself, then no, I wouldn't help them. But I mean, when you can, you do. And it should be consensual like that, because do you not see the difference between that situation and one which involves the state? Because the state isn't just walking by some homeless guy and then giving them something that they need because they need it and the state has it. The state is just taking from everyone and giving to just about anyone who meets their very vague criteria to give money to. And it's draining the productive people. It's creating an environment for less productive people to be born. It's terrible. Like, the national debt is, well, we've already talked about it, is stealing from the unborn. And that is the cause of socialism, of not having enough money to steal from your taxed livestock to provide the things that you're promising to provide. So they take loans off of the unborn. It's one of the most disgusting practices in all of human history, and it is caused by socialism.
I would agree that it is stealing from the unborn, yeah. But to get back to the original thing, you and I probably would both agree with Ayn Rand's understanding that altruism can go too far. So whenever you say, if you're about to starve yourself, you don't have a duty to feed that other person before feeding yourself, of course. But
I don't think there's really any situation in which you would have a duty, unless maybe it was your child, but then even or your close relative.
That's where we disagree, I think, is you don't feel that you have the duty to do this.
Well, it's because it's to me it's objective. Like if I had an obligation to feed starving people, then I'd be having to try to feed starving people all day every day because there's starving people everywhere.
Yes, and that would be a problem.
That would be a problem because I have time preferences and I want to use my time for my own.
And you would run out of money very fast.
Very fast.
Even people that aren't starving would be like, "Hey, I want a free cheeseburger." I agree with you 100%. If that's where I stopped, I think I would be a libertarian. If that's where I said, "Okay, my mind's made up." But this problem continues afterwards because what you just described is saying you can't do this on your own. So therefore, we have to all work together to solve this problem. But just to use the example,
we don't have to. If we followed our own self-interests and people followed their own self-interests and they had to work to eat, then this problem would solve itself. Like Thanksgiving itself, it happened because the colonies who almost starved by trying to socialize the cost and the work that goes into growing food, they almost starved doing that. But then when there was like 20 people left in the colony, they said, fuck it, you go do your own thing over there in your house and I'll do my own thing. And then Thanksgiving came around and they all had food. They had more food than they can eat. And that's why we have Thanksgiving. It's thanks to private property. It's thanks to capitalism that the traditions like that ever even started.
Did you just say Thanksgiving was a result of capitalism?
It was. If the colonists would have kept trying to their socialized version of farming, if they would have kept trying to do that, they would have literally starved to death. The first colonists.
I will give you that they tried to. They did really try to have a communist. Oh, what was that?
Jamestown, I think, or something.
Yeah, and it wasn't Jamestown, but it totally failed immediately.
I mean, literally 90% of people starved trying to socialize the cost and the effort that goes into farming and food production.
So back to the original point here. I do feel that there is a moral necessity to make sure that this person doesn't starve next to me, right? Let's go back to the island. If I walk up and there I see you with 100 coconuts and the other guy with 0 coconuts, I need him to be able to eat regardless of what happened, okay? Regardless of how he got in the situation. Now, I can obviously say if he was lazy the whole time and you worked hard to get your coconuts, hey, that he's getting what he deserved, right? But still, I need him to eat food.
You need him to eat food. What necessity does anything that you own require him to eat food?
And I would even take it a step farther and say, I don't have any coconuts to give him. So I'm going to come over to you and literally use force, take your coconut and take it over to him and give it to him.
That is so wrong.
I have a moral need to steal your coconuts in that scenario, even though I recognize that I'm stealing. Even though I recognize.
So ethics go out the window if people need things. Like, I mean, where is ethics something that's relative to you? Does it change upon any given situation?
Ethics are constantly being trumped by one another in different scenarios, right? If I took my son and I got a pair of pliers and I yank his tooth out, this is a really unethical thing. Like, that's monstrous.
Well, yeah, but there's people out there with no teeth that need teeth, so it's ethical. I don't know what you're talking about.
In the situation where he has a problem with his tooth, I have to take him to the dentist. I'm still yanking his tooth out. I'm just paying someone else to do it, right?
Well, and he has a problem with his tooth.
Absolutely. So I'm using this to say something that you and I would agree about. And one ethic is being trumped by the other ethic at that moment. I'm causing him suffering, but it's for a greater good. And that's what taxation is. I am doing something unethical to you, but it's for the greater good.
Do you not get how that's a performative contradiction? It's like
of course it's a contradiction, but all
so it can't be logically true. It can't be true. You can't be providing for the greater good if you're harming me to do it. Because how is providing for this government or this government military that doesn't really protect me? It's really just a constant threat to me. It's always bombing other people, creating an environment for refugees and all this to come flying into my country and trying to shift the demographics of my country. Like, how can any of that be for the greater good? Like, I mean, paying these politicians who don't produce anything, massive salaries and massive pensions, so much productivity and value is lost in society because we keep straying down this path that has been tried again and again and again. We've got to, you might not like this, but we've got to physically remove these people. The people who want socialism, the people who enable it, the people who enact it through legislation. We cannot tolerate these people in society. It's kind of, if you allow them in your society, they will bring about the environment to enable socialism, communism, whatever ideology they advocate.
You sound a lot like Marx. Actually, you sound a lot like him, just with different.
Marx was a loser, though. I mean, come on.
We can at least admit that he changed the world in a major way.
Oh yeah, you got 100 million plus people dead.
Yeah. Okay, so you are saying that you don't have to do something for someone else, even if they have a need.
Absolutely,
right?
You don't.
So, behind the veil of ignorance, what if you're that guy that doesn't have any coconuts?
I have no right to the coconuts. I mean, he doesn't deserve shit. To get that send that motherfucker off in the ocean, okay? Make him swim somewhere.
I think you're stuck in what would be called virtue ethics. That kind of like Kantian way of seeing it, where you're wanting to have this supreme system where there isn't anything wrong happening.
No, I definitely don't pretend that things bad wouldn't happen. Like, I know that they would. It's just I'm saying that the purpose of property rights is to avoid conflicts, right? Like, so that if we had the Garden of Eden, we'd have to establish property rights or property norms at least to where you can't use the same thing I'm using at the same time, and we can't be in the same space at the same time, right? We've got to. Property norms are established to avoid conflict, and the state creates conflict by violating them directly.
Wouldn't you say that you have a debt to pay to humanity?
No, not at all. Like, what? No, I have to provide for myself, and no one has to provide for me. If I pretended that other people had to provide for me, I'd be pretending that they're my slaves, that they owe me a human effort and work to provide me with what I believe that I need. Or even if I literally need it, it's still putting what I need on their shoulders, and that's not right. It's unethical.
So this is a general concept from Simone de Beauvoir, who explained that the only way that you and I are here right now and that we're benefiting from how successful mankind has been is because of what has happened before us. So therefore, we have a debt to pay back into the system in a fundamental way. So I'm trying to get to the fundamentals of morality here, right? Whenever you see someone that needs something, say the guy with no coconuts, you have a debt to humanity itself to make sure that he eats.
Who placed this upon your shoulders? What placed this upon your shoulders? What did
existing itself?
But
it's the social contract, and even though you didn't sign it, you have a debt to pay.
See, this is where socialists they confuse society and government. Like, the government isn't society and society isn't government. Like, society is what provided us with all these revolutionary technologies and all these living standard boosting things, right? It wasn't government. Government was sitting in the back the whole time, pointing guns at people and robbing them to provide for their agendas, right?
That's a good point. It does conflate the two a little bit.
Oh, a whole lot.
I'm trying to defend government with my comment about Simone de Beauvoir's ethics. You and I probably agree about a lot about the government, but I'm trying to keep it on just the ethics level of saying, when you see someone in need, you have a duty to help them because you have a debt to pay back to society because you are benefiting from society. So even if we were in a situation where there was no government, okay, take that out, you still have a duty to other human beings.
The only way I'd have a duty to other human beings is if, like, they did something for me, and then I would even it almost have to even be contractual.
We have done something for you.
What did that guy who's starving do for me if I've never met him, never ran into him, except this time I'm walking out the gas station and there he is?
The benefits that you have in life are here because of what mankind has done for you. You owe us.
That doesn't follow.
You are able to appreciate, let's say, art, right?
Okay.
You're able to watch TV. You're able to have a car, let's say. These things are a result of mankind working together to make this happen. Okay, and I'm not trying to promote collectivism right now. Okay, I'm just saying this is the result of other people that came before you that put in, and now it's your turn to put back in. That's why I say you have this debt to pay to humanity. So whenever you see the starving person, he is humanity.
Is it not giving back to society if you participate in the free market and provide a service or create products for people that they are willing to pay you for or pay for the product itself? So you are providing for society if you just simply participate in society. So if you just participated in the free market, you would be paying back.
Yeah, that would be one form of meeting that goal. Absolutely. But the difference here is.
But the thing is that if that's giving back to society, right? If just participating in the free market is giving back to society, then why does there need to be a third party come take more from you for society?
Because is that sufficient?
Okay, here's my next question. To what extent do you have to go to provide for these people? Do you need to sell your microphones and your computers to bring up the finances to give these people food that are around you that can't get it on their own?
That's where the conversation would get interesting. But to get there, we would have to both admit that we have a responsibility to make sure that guy without coconuts gets a coconut today.
Well, and the only thing I think that people kind of have a responsibility to naturally, it would be to preserve property rights and proprietarian culture. Like,
why do you value property rights higher than, like, you're making like a moral claim with property rights, but where I'm not understanding is why do you put property rights at a higher moral standard than someone starving, for example?
Because your right to your body and your things is more important than that person's need for food.
That sounds ridiculous to me.
Because if your rights didn't come before them, then any state can come in and say, all of what you produce is mine, and I will decide what's done with it, and there could be no moral objection to that because you owe a duty to society and the government is taking it from you without your consent, right?
Your property rights have more value than whether or not someone eats today.
Yeah, because without property rights, all your other rights go with it. The government can hire goons to force you to do whatever they want. If you don't respect property rights, that's what can happen.
That's a slippery slope fallacy.
Does the government not?
Well, I agree with you on most of your criticisms of the government. But my point is, if you can't make your decision based on the fear of the slippery slope outcome.
But is it really a slippery slope if the government right now literally hires policemen who will drag you to a cage if you violate the edicts of the socialist state? They do. Okay. That's so. I don't see how it's a slippery slope then if it's literally happening today and in virtually every country across the planet.
That's what the fallacy is called.
Well,
it's just the name.
But it's only a slippery slope if it's like something that's. If you're assuming, like, a slippery slope would be saying, because the government has these rights to take us to a cage for doing things against what they like, right? Then they're gonna round us all up. They're gonna round up all the white people or whatever. They're gonna round up all the black people, all the minorities, and Donald Trump's gonna kill them. That'd be a slippery slope. But describing something that happens whenever it's actually when it is happening.
No, it's still a slippery slope, even if it is true. The logic itself is the fallacy. Even if I said smoking cigarettes is bad for you, and then you see me light up a cigarette and you say, hey, you're smoking, so what you were saying earlier was a bunch of BS because you're a hypocrite, that's still a tu quoque fallacy. It's still not thinking accurately about the logic itself. So what I'm saying is, whenever you reduce the whole argument down to whether or not you have a duty to help someone else in property rights outweigh someone starving, and you say the reason that I'm going to do this is because it's going to lead to that, that's still following property rights.
Well, if that person who is starving, if their property rights didn't trump other people's need, then someone who needs food more could somehow, go in, this is kind of slippery slope too, but go in and take what nutrients they have in their body and put it in their body because they need it more. So property rights have to be protected for both the person starving and the person who's filthy freaking rich. Or you get into a contradictory, unethical situation, like where you have to do something bad for the greater good.
Are you saying the property rights are the reason that we're concerned about the other person eating? Is that what you're trying to say?
I don't know if I would say that exactly, but I would say that other people's self-interest would conflict because people don't want to go around seeing other people starving in the first place. And I think if you had a starving person problem in a libertarian social order, that people would come together and form charities to solve the problem because they don't want that. It devalues the society, the property in which the starving people reside, because homelessness brings down the value of property.
Wouldn't you agree with me that we have an obligation to help someone else that's in need?
But you'd have to prove the ethical obligation of it, and I just don't. I don't think you can prove the ethical obligation of it without accidentally, which this also causes it not to be proof, making the person providing for the needy a slave to the needy.
In a way, yeah, I think we are.
But that's unethical, right? I thought we said slavery was unethical earlier.
Like literal slavery?
Well, chattel slavery and tax slavery isn't much different.
Well, you're conflating terms there. Slavery in the sense that we have a duty to one another as members of humanity. No, I don't have a problem with slavery in that sense. But that'll be the that'll be the recording that gets edited and put next to my face on Google somewhere of me saying, Robert's for slavery.
Well, I would say that you do kind of tacitly argue that slavery isn't wrong.
In the way that you're conflating the two terms, I would say, no, it's not wrong in that sense. But if we are capable of both agreeing that we have a duty to one another and an unsigned social contract that we are responsible for, then I would say that we could move on to then try to address how can we improve the world around us? What is the best economic system? And that I wouldn't be proposing anything like Stalin or Pol Pot or something along those lines, of course.
It never starts out like that. We are the good socialists who will bring about the utopia. We are not the Stalins or the Marxes or the Hitlers or the Mao Zedongs or the Kim Jong-uns. Let me try to unconflate and equate what you perceive to be a conflation. Is that if forcing someone to work either by a whip, how is that any different than forcibly threatening to hurt someone if they don't give you the value that they produce while you're not actually whipping them, like while they're just working? It's not, I don't see it as much of a big difference. I mean, it's not, I know that they're not the same exact defined terms, but they are analogous, certainly.
You're 100% right. That is wrong. Yeah.
So we agree socialism is wrong and unethical, right?
100%.
Oh my goodness. Hopefully that was a red pill moment for you. No.
I agree it's unethical, but it's the scenario of taking your kid to the dentist again.
Well, no. It's the the means justify the end is what it is. So what is the capped income? What's your cap income? What's the top income I can make before I'm taken from other people?
Do we need a maximum wage?
I'm not calling it a wage because people who make the most money don't get paid in wages. You know, they get paid by what they, checks for, for production.
I don't think a cap would be the best solution, but perhaps reverting something back to, 50, 60 years ago when the top 10% were being taxed at roughly 90%.
But there's also more allowed, they allowed them to write off more than at any other time in history. So they basically really only paid like 30%. But trying to put my consciousness in your skull, it would feel like that you would still, even if you had this exact society constructed and you were living in it, even though that guy's still making more than you, even though he's getting taxed a little bit more, I feel like you would still have disdain for this guy who's making more, and you would still want the state to take more from him so that you could have more.
So you're saying that in this veil of ignorance scenario that we were talking about previously, that even with someone having slightly more than me, I would still have a problem with him having more.
Yeah, it's or not even necessarily you yourself, but just a socialist pawn in that society, right? Just kind of like in the average socialist in your dream society, right?
I can understand why you'd feel that way, but I think that would probably be a mischaracterization of socialists.
Well, I just don't see how, you wouldn't still have that disdain, because, it seems like you just, don't you, is it not a thing about wanting everyone to be equal as to why you want the person who can't produce very much to have almost as much as you or as much as you?
So my concern would be more about providing necessities for people, not necessarily luxuries. I think that the world is more ethical now in places where you have water being piped into your home, as opposed to just leaving that to the market. If it would be even more ethical, for instance, if you weren't even charged for the water that's piped into your home. Not that I'm trying to get off onto a water debate.
Well, the thing I have with that is that you'd need that Garden of Eden situation to have that. Water would have to be a non-scarce resource. Food would have to be non-scarce. When in the end, it is scarce. The reality that we live in, water and food and electricity and all that is scarce. And therefore, we need to utilize property rights to avoid conflict over this.
The scarcity causes the conflict to begin with.
Well, no, the unassigning property to private property owners is what causes conflict. Whenever two people think they have the same claim to property to which neither has claimed or has a rightful claim, then that creates a conflict. If you want to do something with this water that I don't, then we're going to have a conflict.
And I think we've come full circle right back to the original point that we give the government a monopoly of force.
I wouldn't call it giving.
Yeah, good point. Without that, I would just come take all your stuff.
But is that really what you would do? In a debate about ethics, you're going to tell me that without a government putting a gun to your head, that you would come and steal my shit if there wasn't that? If property rights were all that were between me and, or my property and you would take my property.
Using me as the example, not just random criminal action, no, but if I'm starving and I need to eat, then yeah, your property rights aren't as important. Or if those that count on me need to eat, then I could care less about your property rights in that scenario.
So would you agree that most people would kind of think like that?
Yeah.
Well then, do you think that this socialism is going to be achieved through democracy?
That's the only way it could successfully be achieved.
Well, it's just, you're putting all these, I guess the only word I can come up with is thuggish people. You're assuming that these thuggish people, who at the end of the day will steal your shit if they just happen to need it a certain amount, that they're going to be able to vote in the right people to bring about this socialist almost world of absent scarcity because everyone has what they need or has it provided to them. It seems like it's just how can you trust these incompetent thugs to elect competent heroes?
Well, that would be another philosophical concept called the wisdom of crowds.
It almost sounds like the tragedy of the commons to me.
Explain.
Oh, do you know what the tragedy of the commons is?
No.
Well, it's kind of it's pretty popular philosophical theory, almost as popular as Plato's cave. And but yeah, the tragedy commons where basically all the farmers come to the public property, they overuse it, and then the property becomes unusable because they've used it to the extent to which it's unusable, right? They've ruined the value of the property because it is commonly owned.
Right. Well, I was more referencing in a democracy, many minds coming together, making decisions, in unison, and that would increase the chances of us getting something right. But in terms of resources, I would be concerned in a capitalist system where the more resources you have, the more you get to accumulate, and therefore the more you take from others because you have the money to purchase more.
But whose rights have they violated, or who have they been unethical to by just accumulating wealth?
Before we go there, just to finish my point, if you continue to increase your wealth and can increase your property and resources, you will have more influence over the community and over politics and what have you, and therefore laissez-faire is the opposite of democracy.
Well, no, having laissez-faire doesn't mean that the richest people at the top have control of some territorial monopolist on ultimate decision-making. That just means that they've accumulated the most wealth through voluntary contractual means. There's nothing unethical about that. That's just providing products and services for people, especially if we're talking about in an environment where there is no state to help them and keep their competitors out of the market. Then these people unequivocally deserve everything that they've earned and nothing taken from them, especially if they've done things without government, like I said.
My point is that being anti-collectivist is essentially anti-democratic.
No, I'm not even really anti-collectivist. I mean, I'm not against people making private property covenants and agreeing to making a real social contract to where they agree to property norms and, whatever else they need to agree to live peaceably together. I'm not against that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Even if, even if they want to physically remove all socialists and communists from their society, there's nothing wrong with that because they have a right to exist. They have a right to their own nation, to make their own nation, and to have the culture that they want.
Can you get my point that if you have most of the money, then you're going to dominate most of the resources? And
I wouldn't say that because, you have your own self-interest. You're not going to want to let people own your land. That fallacy that a bunch of commies put out is that in a libertarian free market society that someone would buy up the planet and own the planet and then there'd be, a king over the whole earth. No, not possible. First of all, just the laws of economics, the value of the properties would go up so high that by the time he got half the world bought, the rest of it would be so expensive he'd go bankrupt trying to buy any of it. Because of scarcity, because there's only so much land, and if he owns half of it, all the value, the people who own the other half are going to be able to raise their prices exponentially. And, of course, there's also people who love their property so much that they wouldn't sell it for any price, right?
This has happened in our history, though. We can reference times in human history where these libertarian concepts have failed us.
Wait, where?
Well, the fall of Rome, for one thing.
That was democracy. That was democracy.
Sure, but right around the time of Julius Caesar, right, there were these three guys, the triumvirate, that took over Rome and used their financial dominance to completely destroy the whole city. Julius Caesar got there militaristically, even though he was very wealthy, but the other two guys were just that typical rich guy, right? One of them was Cassius, I can't remember the other one, but it's like that, that evil rich dude that just does a whole bunch of corrupt shit, right?
Donald Trump.
Right. So Cassius was the worst of the bunch, all right? He would just come over and light your house on fire, but he owned the only fire department, so he would come over and say, hey, your house is burning, I'll buy it from you for like less than half the price, and obviously you're going to take that deal because otherwise he's just going to let it burn. And even if he didn't light the fire in the first place, still, by use of the fire department being privatized instead of public, he was able to say, hey, this is just my stuff now. I'm going to put the fire out. And he ended up acquiring majority of the city that way. And that's because they didn't have the same rights that we do today. And I know you would argue, well, they still had those rights. Their rights were still violated. But I would say, no, they didn't, because we didn't write that down back then. Rights are given to you. They are not inalienable.
But they were all vying for power over the state. They were vying for state power. They weren't trying to just privatize everything. I'm not even too sure if Rome didn't prevent other firefighting competitors from jumping in the market. Like, I'm not real sure if they did that.
There's no market if you're the top dog.
Well, there's only if you have a monopoly. If there's still a market as long as there's competitors.
The only way that you're going to have a market is with the government, because we make the rules that prevent you from screwing it up.
Man, free trade. You get the free trade only needs like 2 sentences, right? 2 sentences is all you need for free trade. That's ship in what you want, or ship out what you want to ship out, and ship in what you want to ship in. That's free trade. It doesn't take,
But you're going to be fundamentally limited in what products and services you have options to attain, because he who has the gold makes the rules, just like in the scenario with Cassius's fire department. In this libertarian system, you don't have a Bill of Rights. You don't have a Constitution.
Well, I see it going so much against the self-interest of basically every individual on the planet. So much so that they could never achieve such control, especially with people who have, a love for freedom. Yeah, and, even on an American scale, the American government can't go too far, right? It can't go too far. People will freak the fuck out. That's why your people have to have these Overton window moving conversations to move the Overton window further to the left so that they can have more socialism.
Like as if we have a hidden agenda, you mean?
Well, I mean, of course, you want to get to your end society, right? And I want to get to my end society, right? That ain't a secret.
Except that socialism is a goal like democracy. I mean, pure socialism would be devastating, just like pure democracy would be devastating.
Well, yeah, because, you can't just have socialists in society. No one would produce anything.
Because we're all just lazy. Hey, I really enjoyed talking to you, man, but I got to get out of here. I would just end by saying that I agree with you. Socialism is unethical. However, it's a necessary evil, and that I would steal your coconuts if given the opportunity.
Well, I will definitely reiterate that I stand on the side that socialism is unethical, that if you can't trust people to live peacefully within their own private property rights, that there's no feasible way that you could ever conceive them running a government in any efficient way, electing it or running it themselves personally. The way that socialists act, to me, it seems like they confuse the distinction between government and society, and every time that someone like me objects to a thing being done by socialists, they conclude that we object to it being done at all. Like if we disapprove of state education, that we disapprove of anyone being educated at all, or that if we refute or state religion or state enforced equality, that we don't want equality or religion at all, or that if we don't want the state to feed people, that we don't want people fed. Like, it's not like that. Socialism is the institutionalized aggression against private property, and that is why it's unethical, is because it is essentially you have to have a state to steal from people to provide the socialized gimme-dats for all the welfarists, essentially. And I'd like to thank you for coming on. It was a great conversation, even though we disagree quite a lot.
Well, we only disagreed on 2 things, really. If not for those 2 things, we probably agree on everything else.
But I think they're monumental disagreements.
Yeah, good point.
Anyway, Robert, I'd like to thank you for coming on. Everybody else, come and check out radcapradio.com/store, get your shirts, and we will see you next time.
A frustrating but very fun conversation with Jimmy. Find more of him at radcapradio.com. The music you're hearing is brought to you, as always, by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com. Love his music. Next week, we have the Scathing Atheist, everybody. No illusions. He is the funniest human being in existence, and we're going to lighten things up a little bit, maybe have a couple laughs. That's next week. The Scathing Atheist. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you want to join me in the fight within the marketplace of ideas, please make your dollar contribution at patreon.com/right. That's patreon.com/RIGHT. If you don't have a buck, then just tell somebody about the show. That's cool. Whatever you do is appreciated, because we're a team, and together we are fighting for the right to reason.